Mr. President, before we cast our votes on this bill, I just ask that we consider three things. Number one, the nature of the alleged problem that this bill seeks to address, whether this legislation actually addresses that perceived problem, and then finally, the cost of passing this legislation, both in terms of dollars and cents and on the human cost to some of our most vulnerable populations here in the state. First, is there a problem with voter fraud in North Dakota? The public statements of our chief election officer give us a clue in terms of the answer to that question. Reading briefly from the publication put out by the Secretary of State entitled North Dakota, the only state without voter registration, this pamphlet asks, is voter fraud possible in North Dakota? Yes. Have there been incidents of widespread voter fraud in North Dakota? No. Does North Dakota have widespread problems with non-citizens voting? No. Now, Mr. President, there may be some who take issue with the qualifier widespread in those previous statements. Fair enough. Let's look precisely at how much voter fraud has actually occurred in this state. The Secretary of State just 2 months ago, and on the heels of a fiercely competitive U.S. Senate general election, said, quote, in his 20 years as Secretary of State, we have only had 1 or 2 or 3 cases we'd consider fraud, close quote. 1 or 2 or 3 in 20 years. But we can slice the pie even more thinly than that, Mr. President. Between 2000 and 2010, the total number of voter fraud cases prosecuted in North Dakota is a small number. In fact, it's barely a number at all. 1 case of voter fraud was prosecuted in North Dakota in 10 years. During the same 10 years, 2,259,312 ballots were cast in North Dakota. 1 person was prosecuted for fraud. Let's put that into a little bit of perspective. The odds of being struck by lightning in a given year, according to the National Weather Service, which is somewhat of an authority on the issue, are 1 in a million. The odds of voter fraud happening in a given decade in the state are 1 in 2,259,312. So, Mr. President, maybe you're thinking that the rate of actual voter fraud is higher than the rate of prosecutions for voter fraud. Again, fair enough. In that case, let's take a look at the allegations that my friend from Bismarck mentioned. He thought it was 9 or 10. It's actually 9. 9 out of 325,862 ballots that were cast last fall. I mean, you can pretty much name off 9 names. That's the rate of alleged voter fraud that occurred in arguably the most competitive election in North Dakota's history. Now, we all agree that voter fraud is a very bad thing. There's no question about that. But even if all of these cases are proved to be voter fraud, and even if all of the alleged cases of fraud occurred in the same legislative district, that alleged fraud would not have changed the outcome of one legislative race across the state. So in part because of this practically non-existent rate of voter fraud and the practically non-existent rate of voter fraud allegations, North Dakota was ranked number 1 amongst all 50 states by the Pew Charitable Trust when it comes to the election administration. This is in 2010. Mr. President, you can't do much better than number 1. So will this bill fix the problem? By any fair measure, there is no problem. But if you believe there is a problem, let's ask ourselves, will requiring voter ID fix this perceived problem? And so let's go back to those 9 allegations of voter fraud from the last election. Those suspected cases of fraud involve people who allegedly voted once by absentee and then another time at the polls. Mr. President, that person could vote at home, show up on election day, smile at the poll worker, show an ID, and vote again. This bill will have no impact on those 9 alleged cases of voter fraud that happened last election. So what's the cost? Mr. President, the dollar cost is readily apparent, a little over $200,000. But the cost to our senior citizens is even more than that. So 18% of Americans, elderly Americans, can't get a photo ID, or don't have a photo ID, more accurately. Can they get them? Sure. But why should someone who's been voting in the same precinct for decades have to drive from Beach to Dickinston to get a photo ID to show to their neighbor who's working the polls? It makes absolutely no sense. Mr. President, this is part of a national partisan movement on voter ID. This body is bigger than that. Those charges just don't square with the scrupulously honest voters that we have in North Dakota. I would hope that we can reject this bill. It's misguided and it doesn't serve a purpose in our state.